I quit calling it in. That's the first thing I need you to understand before I tell you the rest of this. Because if you go looking for a report with my name on it after September of last year, you won't find one. Not because nothing happened. Because I learned what happens when you keep calling. Subscribe if you want more of these. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Because I'm always curious how far these stories travel. My name's Hutch. Wayne Hutchins. But nobody's called me Wayne since my mother passed, so Hutch is fine. I run cattle on 190 acres off County Road 411, southwest of Cuero, down where Sandy's Creek bends toward the Guadalupe, before it lets go, and just kind of wanders off through the brush on its own. DeWitt County. If you know it as the Turkey Place, or the place with the courthouse square, and the wildflowers in April. Or maybe you know it because there was a thing back in 2007, a rancher named Phyllis Canyon, up in Cuero proper, found some hairless animals dead on her place, and the story got picked up everywhere, Inside Edition, the whole circus. They tested the DNA. Coyote, the lab said. Mangy coyote. End of story. Everybody moved on. I want to tell you, before anything else, that I believed that. For 17 years, I believed that. I've got bobcats on this place. I've got coyotes. I've had a fox den under my equipment shed 2 years running, and I know what an animal with mange looks like. Raw and pink and miserable. And I know what a coyote kill looks like, which is ugly and loud and leaves a mess you can smell from 40 yards. I believed the lab. I had no reason not to. This is mostly cattle country, but I keep a herd of about 30 dairy and meat goats too, down along the creek bottom where the grazing's better, in a stretch of land my own grandfather worked back in the 50s before he moved the family operation north to Yorktown. The ground out here is that flat to gently rolling Gulf Coast plain you get all through this part of Texas, mesquite and high-sake thickets giving way to open pasture, the soil a caliche clay mix that turns to brick in August, and to soup after a hard rain. We're close enough to the Eagle Ford shale play that you'll hear the occasional well pad humming off in the distance some nights, and there's been more truck traffic on the farm roads the last decade than there used to be. But out where my place sits, off the paved stretch of 411, it's still quiet enough that you can hear a screen door slam from a quarter mile. I run that goat herd mostly for the milk, sell some to a creamery outfit out of Victoria, keep a few back for meat for my own family, and a couple of neighbors who like a young cabrito come fall. 31 years I've kept goats and cattle on this exact piece of ground, through droughts and floods and one bad winter freeze a few years back that about wiped me out, and in all that time I'd never lost an animal I couldn't explain. Then this past September I lost 6 goats in 11 nights, and what was left of them didn't look like any kill I'd ever cleaned up in 31 years of running stock on this creek. And I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just going to tell you what I found, in the order I found it, and you can do what you want with it. If this is the kind of story that gets under your skin the way it got under mine, there's a button below this video that lets you stick around for the rest of it, and there's a community of people in the comments who've sent me their own versions of this same thing happening on their own land, which I'll get into later, because that part scared me almost as much as the goats did. Subscribe if you want to hear where this goes, because I'm telling you right now it isn't over. The first one was a doe, a boar cross, about 4 years old, good producer, name of Patches, because she had this splotch of brown over one eye that made her look like she was always squinting at you with one side of her face. I found her on the morning of September the 9th, lying against the inside of the pen fence, about 15 feet from the gate. My first thought, genuinely, was heart attack. We'd had a run of hot weather that hadn't broken yet, mid-90s even into the second week of September, the kind of heat that sits on this part of the Gulf Coast plain like a wet towel, and goats do sometimes just go down from it, especially the older does. I walked over there with my coffee still in my hand, and I almost didn't put it down to check her close, because I was already halfway to deciding what I believed before I'd looked at anything. That's the thing nobody tells you about finding something wrong. You walk up already building the explanation, before your eyes have finished taking in the evidence. I set the coffee on a fence post, and I knelt down next to her, and the first thing that hit me wasn't the wounds, it was the weight of her. I went to roll her onto her back, to check her belly and underside, and she came up off the ground easier than she should have. Patches was not a small goat. She went 70, 75 pounds easy, and when I got my hands under her shoulder and hip to roll her, she moved like she went 40, like somebody had let the air out of her. I got her rolled and I sat back on my heels and looked at her, and that's when I saw the punctures. 2 of them, on the right side of her neck, just under the jaw, close together, maybe an inch apart, small. I want to say about the size around as a pencil, maybe a hair bigger, and round, with the edges clean, no tearing, no ragged skin pulled up around them the way you'd get from teeth or claws. Just 2 neat holes punched through the hide. I'd been raising goats since I was 9 years old on my granddad's place outside Yorktown, 20 miles south of here, and I have seen every kind of predator damage this part of Texas has to offer. Coyote, bobcat. One time, a feral hog got into a kid pen, and what that did, I won't describe, but you'd know it the second you saw it, because it's chaos, it's torn, and it's wide, and there's blood everywhere, on the ground, on the fence, soaked into the dirt in a stain you can still see, a season later if the rain doesn't wash it out fast enough. There was no blood on the ground under Patches. None. I checked. I got down on my hands and knees in the dirt. Dry dirt. That caliche clay mix we've got out here that goes to brick in a dry spell. And I ran my hand across it under where her neck had been lying, and it was just dirt. Dry, packed dirt. Not even damp. I checked her coat. Nothing. I checked the fence behind her. The ground around the fence. 6 feet in every direction. Nothing. A goat carries somewhere around 3 to 4 liters of blood depending on her size, and Patches was a big girl, so I'd put her closer to 4. 4 liters is most of a gallon. That has to go somewhere. I know how gravity works. I've slaughtered my own stock for the freezer plenty of times over the years, and I know what 4 liters of blood looks like coming out of an animal, because I've seen it happen on purpose, with a knife, under controlled conditions, and it is not subtle. It does not disappear. It pools, it soaks, it stains. I stood up and I looked at the pen. 22 head in there that morning before I found Patches, and the rest of the goats were bunched up at the far corner, away from her, pressed against the fence and each other in a tight knot, and they weren't making any noise. Goats are loud animals. If you've ever been around a herd, you know they'll bleat at you for feed, for water, for nothing, for the sound of their own voice half the time. These 21 goats were dead silent, staring at nothing, just standing there, vibrating slightly, the way an animal does when its whole body is locked up with something it doesn't have a word for. I called my neighbor, Del Salinas, who runs about 80 head of cattle and a smaller flock of sheep on the place adjoining mine to the east, across Sandy's Creek. Del's about 62, been ranching that ground his whole life, his daddy before him, and if there's one man in this part of DeWitt County who's forgotten more about livestock than most people will ever know, it's Del. He came over within the hour, parked his truck by the gate, and walked straight to the pen without me saying much more than, "You need to see this." He knelt down the same way I had, looked at the punctures a long time without saying anything, pressed 2 fingers against the skin around one of the holes, the way you'd check a wound on a living animal, gentle, careful. Then he sat back and looked up at me and said, "Hutch, I want you to humor me on something. Don't say anything. Just go get your phone and take pictures of this exactly how it is, before either one of us touches her again." I did. He didn't tell me why right then. He told me about 20 minutes later, after we'd moved Patches into the shade of the equipment shed to keep her out of the sun while we figured out what to do, and by then his hands had stopped being quite as steady as they usually are. "Back in '09, he said, "I lost 3 sheep over about 2 weeks. Same thing. Punctures on the neck, no blood anywhere. Animal looked deflated like somebody'd let the air out. I called it in to the county extension office, and a man came out, looked at it for 10 minutes, told me coyotes, wrote it on a form, and left. I let it go because what else was I going to do? But I never bought it, Hutch. I've lost stock to coyotes my whole life. I know what that looks like. This wasn't that, and it wasn't that in '09 either. I want to be straightforward with you about something. Dell is not a man given to flights of fancy. He doesn't believe in much beyond the church he goes to on Sunday and the markets in Cuero on Thursday. For him to bring up something from 15 years back, unprompted, standing over a dead goat, meant something to me. It meant I wasn't building this out of nothing. We called the DeWitt County Sheriff's Office that afternoon, mostly because I didn't know who else to call, and because losing livestock is, technically, something you're supposed to report. A deputy came out around 4. A young guy, polite, wrote down what I told him on a little notepad, took a few pictures with his own phone of patches lying in the shed, and told me what I'd more or less expected to hear, which was that without visible bite marks or tracks, there wasn't much to go on, and that predator activity, including coyotes adapting to new prey patterns, was common enough in the county that it likely fell under that. He mentioned, not unkindly, that there'd been more coyote sightings reported near the Eagle Ford shale work sites over the last few years, something about the oil and gas activity pushing wildlife corridors around, animals getting displaced and showing up in places they hadn't before. It was a reasonable thing to say. It didn't explain the blood. I asked him straight out if he'd ever seen a coyote kill that didn't leave blood at the scene. He looked at me for a second, and I want to be fair to him, he didn't dismiss me, he didn't roll his eyes. He said, "Honestly, no sir, I haven't. But I'm not a vet, and I'm not going to tell you I've seen everything there is to see out here." Before he left, he mentioned, almost as an aside while he was getting back in his cruiser, that the department had fielded a handful of similar calls over the years from properties scattered around the county. Nothing recent enough or specific enough for him to recall details, but enough that the description hadn't struck him as completely unfamiliar. He didn't offer to pull those old reports for me, and I didn't think to ask him to until later, after it was too late in the day to catch him again. He left, and that was the end of official involvement, and I understood why, because what was he supposed to write down? There wasn't a form for what I was describing. I buried patches that evening behind the equipment shed, in a spot I'd used before for stock that didn't make it, a little rise of ground above where the creek floods in a wet spring. I want to tell you I slept that night. I didn't. I lay there with the window open because the heat hadn't broken yet, and I listened to this place the way I'd listened to it my whole life, without ever really listening, if that makes sense. The cicadas going, a mockingbird that won't shut up some nights, working through every other bird's song it's ever stolen. Somewhere off toward the creek, the low complaining call of a barred owl. Familiar sounds. Sounds I've fallen asleep to for 31 years on this exact piece of ground. My wife, Connie, was up in Victoria that week visiting her sister, which I've thought about more than once since, because if she'd been home that first night, I don't know that I'd have gone out to the pen the way I did. She called me twice that day, once that afternoon when I told her about patches, keeping it simple, telling her it looked like heat stress, not wanting to worry her over the phone with something I didn't have words for yet myself, and once that evening, a short call, just checking in, neither of us bringing up the goat again. Around 2 in the morning, they stopped. All of it. Not gradual. Like a hand came down over the whole property at once. I lay there in that silence for what felt like a long time but was probably under a minute, and then I got up, because I am not the kind of man who can lie in bed wondering. I got the flashlight off the nightstand, an old aluminum mag light that takes 4D batteries and could double as a club if it had to, and I walked out through the kitchen and onto the back porch in just my jeans and boots, no shirt, and I stood there and listened some more. Nothing. The goat pen was about 60 yards from the house, out past the equipment shed, and even from the porch I could tell, something in the dark out there wasn't right, though I couldn't have told you what. Just a feeling, low in the gut, the kind your body has before your brain's caught up to whatever triggered it. That's when the smell hit me. I want to describe this carefully because I've read other people's accounts of this same thing since, and I want you to know I'm not just repeating what I've read, because I smelled this before I ever went looking for anybody else's story about it. It was sulfur, sharp, like a match just struck, but underneath that there was something else, something I can only describe as chemical, and a little bit sweet, the way a hospital hallway smells, antiseptic, and faintly rotten at the same time. It came in on the breeze off the creek, off to the southeast, And it wasn't strong, not at first, but it built, the way a smell builds when the source of it is getting closer rather than staying put. I went down the porch steps. I'm not going to pretend that was the smart move because Dell told me later it wasn't, and he was right. But I'd lived on this ground my whole adult life, and something about the wrongness of that silence made me want to see it rather than wait it out behind a locked door. I crossed the yard toward the equipment shed with the flashlight off because some instinct told me not to announce myself yet, and I stood at the corner of the shed where I could see the pen without being out in the open. The goats were bunched again, same corner as the morning before, pressed into each other so tight you couldn't have slid a hand between two of them. The motion light I'd had mounted on the shed eave for going on 6 years, the kind that trips on movement and throws a hard white wash over that whole side of the yard, hadn't come on. I want to be specific about that because it matters. That light trips for raccoons. It trips for possums. It trips for my own cat walking across the yard at 100 feet. Whatever was out there either wasn't moving in a way the sensor could read, or it was already inside the cone of the pen where the sensor doesn't reach because the shed itself blocks that angle. The smell was strong now, strong enough that my eyes started watering a little, the way they do around a chemical spill, and underneath the sulfur, there was a faint warmth to the air I couldn't account for, like standing too close to a running engine. I clicked the flashlight on and swept it toward the pen. I'm going to tell you what I saw, and I'm not going to dress it up or hedge it, because I've done enough of that in my own head over the months since, trying to talk myself into some version that fits easier into what I know about the natural world, and none of those versions hold up against what was actually standing at the edge of my goat pen that night. It was crouched at the base of the fence, on the outside, the creek side, where the chain link meets a cedar post I'd set the same year I built that pen, back in '94. Low to the ground, weight forward on what I'd call front limbs, though calling them that doesn't feel right either, because when it shifted its weight a second later and rose up, it came up onto 2 legs as easy as a man standing from a crouch, no awkwardness to it at all. Like the 4-legged stance and the 2-legged stance were both equally natural to it, and it just picked whichever one suited the moment. Upright, it stood maybe 4.5 feet, not much taller. The body was narrow through the chest and hips, almost too narrow, like something built for speed rather than strength, though I'd find out later that didn't mean it lacked strength. The skin, in the flashlight beam, had a gray cast to it with an undertone of green, the way a healthy cactus pad looks right before it starts going pale from too much sun, and it had a wet sheen to it that I first took for actual wetness, like it had come up out of the creek. But the longer I watched it, the more I understood that the sheen was just the texture of the skin itself, smooth, hairless, faintly reflective. Down the spine, starting at the back of a head that sat low and wide on narrow shoulders, there ran a line of raised ridges, not soft like a mane, hard-looking, like cartilage, spaced close together and running the length of the back as far as I could see, before the angle and the dark swallowed the rest of it. They weren't still. There was a tremor running through them, fast, fine, almost like a hand shaking, and as I watched, that tremor seemed to sync up with something I could feel rather than hear, a low pressure that started building behind my own eyes and in the bones of my face, the way your ears feel on a fast elevator ride, except it kept building instead of leveling off. The forelimbs, when it was down low at the fence, ended in something I had a hard time settling on a word for at the time, and still do. Not quite hands, not quite paws. Long, narrow digits, 4 of them as far as I could count in that light, tipped with something dark and hooked, curled under, and gripping the ground the way a bird grips a branch, rather than the way a dog plants a paw flat. When it rose up to standing, those same limbs hung loose at its sides, and I watched the fingers flex once, slow, deliberate, the way a man might stretch his hand out after holding a tool too long. The mouth, when I caught a glimpse of it as the head turned, was a tight horizontal line that didn't look like it opened wide the way a dog's or a cat's would. What I saw of the throat beneath it had a faint, irregular pulse to it, visible even through the skin, a soft, shifting glow somewhere underneath the surface, dim, reddish, there and then not there, like watching somebody's pulse through the back of their hand in low light. the head turned toward me. I'd had the flashlight on it dead center the whole time, and the eyes did not throw light back the way every other animal eye does on this place. Every coyote, every bobcat, every deer I've ever caught crossing the road at night. That flat-colored shine you get off a retina. These ate the beam. Two black ovals, set wide on a head that was otherwise smooth and almost featureless apart from a slit of a mouth and what I'd guess were nostril openings. No visible ears that I could make out. The eyes held the light and gave nothing back, and they were looking, I want to be clear about this, they were looking at me specifically, not at the shed, not at the yard in general, at me. I don't know how long we stood like that. Dell asked me afterward and I genuinely couldn't tell him, because time didn't move right during it, the way it doesn't move right in a car accident, where your brain is taking in more information per second than it usually does, and the clock in your head can't keep up with it. My best guess, working backward from how long it took the pressure behind my eyes to build to where it was almost unbearable, would be somewhere around 15 to 20 seconds. It felt like several minutes. The pressure peaked right around the time the thing tilted its head, just slightly, the way a barn owl will tilt its head at a sound it's trying to place, and that tilt seemed to be the trigger for what happened next, which is that my legs stopped working the way I told them to. I don't mean I was frozen with fear, though I was plenty afraid. I mean there was a specific, physical heaviness that came down through my chest and into my legs, like wading into water that's deeper and colder than you expected. And I found I could not make myself take a step in either direction, forward or back. The flashlight in my hand started to shake, not from my own trembling, or not only from that, but I swear to you there was a vibration in the metal itself that matched the tremor running through the ridges on its back, like the thing was putting out something that the aluminum of that flashlight was picking up and passing into my palm. Then, somewhere behind it, off in the dark past the tree line along the creek, there was a sound. Not loud, a single low note, almost like a foghorn heard from a long way off, except shorter, more clipped, gone almost as soon as it started. The creature's head turned toward that sound, away from me, and the pressure behind my eyes broke all at once, like a held breath let go, and my legs were mine again. It dropped back to all fours in that same seamless motion, and it was gone into the dark along the creek before I'd even gotten the flashlight beam to follow it. No sound of brush breaking, no splash at the creek crossing, which there should have been, because that crossing runs maybe 8 inches of water even in a dry September, and anything moving through it at speed throws sound. I stood at that corner of the shed for what Dell later guessed, based on when I called him, was close to 25 minutes, not moving, the flashlight beam locked on the spot at the fence where it had been, until my arms started cramping from holding it level that long. The motion light over the shed never did come on, not once. I checked the pen at first light, all 21 remaining goats alive, but 2 more dead, found in the morning the same way as Patches, lying near the back of the pen where I hadn't been able to see the night before with the angle I'd had. Same wounds, same absence of blood. One of them, a yearling buck I hadn't gotten around to naming yet, had a faint burn-looking mark along one flank, reddened, hairless in a strip about 3 inches wide, that I'd never seen on a goat before in my life, and couldn't explain with anything in my own experience. Connie got home from Victoria that afternoon, 2 days earlier than planned, because her sister had come down with something, and decided she'd rather nurse it alone than have company underfoot. I hadn't told her yet about the second sighting, hadn't figured out how I was going to, and I remember standing in the kitchen when her car pulled up the drive, trying to settle on some version of the truth that wouldn't sound like I'd lost my mind sitting alone on this place for 3 days. She knew something was wrong before I said a word. 34 years married to a woman, you stop being able to hide much from her, and Connie took one look at my face when she came through the door and set her bag down slow and said, "Wayne, what happened?" I told her. All of it. The punctures, the missing blood, the thing at the fence line, the pressure behind my eyes, the way my legs had locked up. I watched her face while I talked, and she didn't interrupt me once, didn't ask a single question until I'd gotten all the way through it, and when I finished, she sat down at the kitchen table, and was quiet for a long moment. "I believe you," she said finally, which wasn't what I'd braced for. "I don't understand it, and I don't like it, but I've been married to you since 1992, and I have never once known you to make something up, and you look like a man who hasn't slept right in 3 days, so I believe you." She didn't want to keep goats on the place at all after that, not for a while, and I understood the impulse even though we both knew it wasn't really practical. 31 years of breeding stock and a milk contract with the creamery that we'd built up over a decade. What we settled on instead was that she'd start sleeping with the bedroom window shut and locked even in the heat, which she'd never done before in all our years on this place, and that I wouldn't go out to the pen alone in the dark again without at least calling Dell first, win or lose on the 15 minutes it might cost. She kept that second rule stricter than I did, if I'm honest, and reminded me of it more than once over the following weeks. I called Dell at 6 in the morning. He was over by 6:30. He looked at the burn mark for a long time without saying anything, running his thumb along the edge of it, and then he looked up at me and said, "Hutch, I think we need to talk to somebody who isn't me or a sheriff's deputy." Before we made that call, we spent close to 2 hours walking the rest of the pen and the fence line surrounding it, looking for anything we might have missed in the dark. The chain link itself showed no damage anywhere, no bent links, no gaps pried open at the base, nothing to suggest the fence had been breached by force rather than gone over or around. Along the bottom rail, where I'd reinforced the original construction with concrete footing blocks back when I built the thing in '94, there was a faint discoloration on 2 of the blocks, a grayish residue that wiped off easily with a wet rag and left no lasting mark, but that neither of us could identify by smell or texture as anything we recognized from normal ranch chemicals, fertilizer runoff, or animal waste. We counted the herd twice that morning, 21 head confirmed alive and accounted for after the 2 additional deaths, and we walked a wider perimeter around the property, maybe 150 yards out from the pen in every direction, checking for tracks in the softer ground near the creek bank and in the dirt road that ran along my property line. We found deer tracks, plenty of them, this being prime rutting season and deer moving heavily through that creek bottom most nights. We found raccoon and possum sign near the equipment shed, the ordinary nightly traffic any rural property gets. We did not find anything resembling the tracks of whatever had stood at that fence line the night before, which told us either that the ground in that immediate area was too hard-packed to hold an impression, or that whatever it was, simply didn't leave the kind of weight-bearing print that everything else on this creek does. Before I get to that, I want to back up and tell you something Dell told me that morning, standing over the yearling buck in the pen, because it changed how I understood everything that had happened the night before, and it's stuck with me since. Dell's family has run cattle and sheep on that ground east of Sandy's Creek since his grandfather's time, going back to the 1930s, and Dell told me that morning that his grandfather used to talk about something coming through that creek bottom every so often, decades apart, killing stock the same way. Punctures, no blood. His grandfather didn't have the word Chupacabra for it, because that word didn't exist yet in this part of Texas, not until the Puerto Rico sightings made the national news in the mid-90s and the term spread. Before that, Dell said, his grandfather just called it the drainer and talked about it the way you'd talk about a flood or a hard freeze, a thing that came around on its own schedule and you couldn't do much except wait it out and protect what you could. He told me about it maybe twice in my whole life, Dell said. Once when I was a boy and lost a lamb the same way, and once near the end when he was real sick and talking about things he didn't usually talk about. He said it came through in the 30s, and again, sometime in the 50s. He wasn't sure exactly when, and he figured it'd come again someday, and he just hoped he wouldn't be the one dealing with it when it did. I asked Dell if his grandfather had ever seen it. Once, Dell said. He wouldn't describe it to me beyond saying it walked like a man some of the time, and like a dog the rest, and that the eyes didn't shine right in a lantern light, same as you're telling me now about your flashlight. He said after he saw it, he started keeping a rifle loaded by the door for the rest of that year, and he never had cause to use it, and he never saw it again after that one time. Not in 50 more years of ranching this creek. I didn't know what to do with that information right away. I still don't, fully, but it did something for me that I think is worth naming, which is that it took the thing I'd seen out of the category of isolated, unexplainable, happening only to me, and put it into a category that felt, strangely, almost worse, a thing with a pattern, a thing that had apparently been coming through this stretch of Sandy's Creek on some kind of long, irregular cycle since before either of our grandfathers were old men, and that nobody outside a couple of ranching families along this water had any reason to know about, because what were you going to do? Report it and have your name attached to a story that sounds like something off a late-night radio show? That same week, more out of a need to do something with my hands than any real expectation of finding answers, I drove into Cuero and spent an afternoon at the DeWitt County Historical Museum on the Courthouse Square, asking the woman who runs the archive room if there was anything in the old county records, newspaper clippings, ranch journals, anything that mentioned unexplained livestock losses going back further than the 2007 Canyon case. She was kind about it, didn't laugh me out of the building, but told me the museum's collection leaned heavy on Chisholm Trail history, the turkey industry, the old gunfights from the Sutton-Taylor feud days, and that anything from small ranching families about something like what I was describing would more likely have stayed in private journals and family Bibles than in anything the county thought worth preserving. She did pull one thing for me, a bound collection of oral history transcripts the museum had done back in the 70s, interviews with old-timers about ranching life in the county going back to the early part of the 20th century. I sat in that archive room for 3 hours going through it page by page, and in a transcript from 1974, an interview with a man named Otto Krennick who'd ranched land near Yorktown his whole life, born around 1890, there was a passage where the interviewer asked him about predator problems over the decades. And Krennick mentioned, almost in passing, a stretch of bad luck, sometime around 1931 or 1932, where he'd lost stock to what he called something that wasn't dogs, animals found drained with small wounds on the neck, no blood at the scene. The interviewer didn't follow up on it. The transcript just moved on to the next question, about drought conditions in the 30s, like the man had said something about the weather instead of something that should have stopped the conversation cold. I made a copy of that page. I've still got it in a folder with the photographs Dr. Calloway took, and Dell's account of his grandfather, and everything else I've collected since, because it's the closest thing to independent documentation I've found that this didn't start with me, and didn't start with Phyllis Canyon's animals in 2007 either, but goes back at least to a Bohemian rancher near Yorktown talking to a museum volunteer in 1974 about something he'd seen 40 years before that, and not getting asked a single follow-up question about it. We drove over to Dell's place that same morning, in part because I needed to get away from my own pen for an hour and clear my head, and in part because Dell wanted to show me something. Out behind his equipment barn, in a part of the property that backs up to the same creek bottom mine does, just a half mile or so downstream, there's an old well casing, capped, that his grandfather had drilled and abandoned sometime in the 40s when it came in dry. Dell walked me out to it and showed me a patch of ground around the base of the casing where nothing grew, a rough circle maybe 10 feet across, bare caliche, with not even the scrub grass that grows everywhere else on that creek bottom. My grandfather wouldn't let cattle graze close to this spot, Dell said. Wouldn't say why exactly, just that something about the ground here wasn't right, and that he'd found stock dead near here more than once over the years. I always figured it was an old chemical spill from when they drilled the well, something in the soil. I had it tested. Oh, must be 15 years back now, after I lost those sheep. Soil came back clean. No contamination, nothing the lab could find that would explain it. I stood there looking at that bare circle of ground with the late September sun already pushing the temperature past 80 before 9 in the morning, and I thought about the smell from the night before, sulfur and something chemical underneath it. And I wondered, not for the first time and not for the last, whether what we were dealing with had some kind of fixed range, a territory built around this particular stretch of water, the way any predator's territory gets built around the resources it depends on. We didn't have an answer for that. We still don't. What we did have, by that afternoon, was a name and a number for Dr. Inez Calloway, and a goat carcass kept cold in a stock tank packed with ice in my equipment shed, waiting on her to come look at it properly, because both of us understood, without saying it out loud, that whatever was happening on this creek needed a set of trained eyes on it that weren't mine or Dell's, before either one of us did something rash, or before we lost so much stock that there wouldn't be anything left to examine at all. Dr. Calloway came out on a Thursday afternoon, the 11th of September, driving a white dually with a stock trailer hitch and a metal case in the bed that looked like something out of a field hospital. She's a woman in her 50s, short gray hair kept practical, the kind of handshake you don't forget, and she's been doing large animal work across DeWitt, Goliad, and Victoria counties for going on 26 years. Dell had used her on calving difficulties and pink eye outbreaks for most of that time and trusted her completely, which counted for a lot with me, because I'd never met the woman before that afternoon, and what I was about to ask her to look at wasn't exactly routine. I'd kept the yearling buck with the burn mark on ice in a stock tank in the shed, and I'd kept Patch's grave marked in case she wanted to see the burial site too, though I told her straight up I wasn't keen on digging Patch's back up unless it turned out to be necessary. She said the fresher specimen would tell her plenty on its own. She pulled on a pair of nitrile gloves at the tailgate of her truck and walked into the shed without much preamble, and I watched her go quiet, the way a person goes quiet when they're working, not unfriendly, just focused, the kind of focus where you can tell the person has stopped performing for you and started actually looking. She examined the puncture wounds first, under a magnifying loupe she kept clipped to her glasses, turning the goat's head gently to get the light right. She was quiet for a long stretch, long enough that Dell and I exchanged a look behind her back. "These are clean," she said finally. "Cleaner than I'd expect from any bite I've documented. No tearing at the margins, no bruising in the surrounding tissue, which tells me the puncture happened fast, with very little lateral movement once it was in. A bite from a canid, even a precise one, drags. The jaw closes and there's almost always some shift, some tearing, because the animal's head moves even slightly during the bite. This didn't drag." She took the goat's rectal temperature, which read close to 91 degrees, which she told us was high for an animal that had been dead and on ice for going on 18 hours by that point. She opened the chest cavity next, working with a scalpel and a pair of long forceps, narrating quietly as she went, mostly to herself, the way I'd imagine a surgeon talks through a procedure for a recording. "Heart's collapsed," she said. "Completely. I want you both to understand what that means, because it's not subtle. In a normal mortality, even one where the animal bled out from a wound, you get pooling. You get residual blood in the chambers, in the great vessels. You get staining in the surrounding tissue from blood that's broken down and started to settle. This heart looks like a deflated balloon. There's nothing in it, not a trace." She moved to the liver next, which she told us should have been a deep reddish brown, engorged the way a healthy goat's liver always is, and instead was pale, almost the color of raw chicken, and noticeably lighter when she weighed a sample on a small scale from her kit than what she said the literature would predict for an animal of that size and condition. She spent a long while after that examining the spleen and the kidneys, both of which showed the same pattern, organs that should have carried a heavy reserve of blood, reduced instead to something closer to dry tissue, light enough in her hand that she said it reminded her more of preserved museum specimens than anything she'd pulled out of a fresh carcass. She checked the goat's mouth and gums too, pulling back the lips to look at the membrane color, which should have shown some lingering pink even after death from residual capillary blood, and found instead a stark, bloodless white that she said she more commonly associated with animals that had been embalmed rather than animals that had died naturally the night before. "I want to be careful here," she said, sitting back on her heels, peeling off one glove to wipe sweat off her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I don't want to tell you something happened that I can't back up, but in 26 years of large animal practice, I have not seen a complete exsanguination like this one, with no blood at the scene, through a wound this small and this precise. I've seen animals bleed out completely from major trauma. I've never seen one bleed out completely through 2 holes the diameter of a pencil, with the surrounding ground bone dry. She took tissue samples from around the puncture wounds, several vials worth, and packed them carefully into a cooler, with ice packs from her truck. She told us she wanted to send them to the diagnostic lab at Texas A&M, the same lab that had handled the DNA testing on Phyllis Canyon's animals back in 2007, because it had the equipment and the reputation to give a result that would hold up if it came to that. Before she left, I asked her, the way I'd asked the deputy a couple days before, if she'd ever seen anything like this in her career, off the record, just her honest read. She looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look where you can tell someone's deciding how much to say. "There's a network," she said finally. "Vets, mostly large animal, scattered across South Texas and into Mexico, who talk to each other off the books about cases like this. Not officially, not in any journal, just calls. Every so often, somebody describing a kill pattern that matches what I just documented here. I've gotten 3 of those calls in my career. This makes 4, including yours." "Where were the others?" Del asked. "One outside Cuero, actually, back in 2007, around the time of the Canyon case. Though it wasn't her animals, it was a smaller operation a few miles south that never made the news. One down near Callahan, in Live Oak County, in 2014, and one across the border, a colleague in Nuevo Laredo, in 2019, who described almost exactly what I just found here, down to the burn-looking lesion on the flank." I asked her what she thought the burn mark was. "I don't know," she said, and I appreciated the honesty of it. "It's not consistent with thermal injury in any way I recognize. The hair follicles in that strip aren't burned at the root. They're just absent, like they never grew there, which doesn't make sense for an injury that happened sometime in the last 24 hours. If I had to guess, and I want you to hear the word guess, I'd say it's consistent with some kind of localized chemical or electrical effect on the tissue, something that disrupted the follicles without damaging the skin around them the way heat or acid would. But that's speculation. I don't have a mechanism for you." She left around 5 that evening with the samples in her cooler, and she told us she'd call as soon as she heard back from the lab, which she expected to take 2 to 3 weeks given normal turnaround times for specialized tissue analysis. I want to tell you that the killings stopped after her visit. They didn't. We lost a 4th goat on the night of September the 14th, found in the same condition the next morning, and a 5th on the 18th. Both times, I checked the property in the dark beforehand and saw nothing, heard nothing, smelled nothing, until I found the bodies at first light. It was like whatever had stood at my fence line that first night had learned, in the space of less than 2 weeks, to come and go without tripping any of my senses at all, which is either a function of how careful it had gotten or a function of how thinly stretched my own attention was getting by that point. Because I want to be honest with you, by the 3rd week of September, I was not sleeping well, and a tired man misses things a rested man wouldn't. Del lost 2 of his own sheep in that same stretch, on nights that didn't line up exactly with mine, which told us, or at least suggested to us, that whatever this was, it was working a loop along that creek bottom rather than fixating on one property. On the night of September the 23rd, I finally saw it again, and this time I wasn't alone, because Del had taken to coming over most nights by then and sitting up with me on the porch, both of us armed, both of us mostly quiet, the way 2 men get when they're sharing a long, uncomfortable watch. It was a little after 1 in the morning. The cicadas had been going strong all night, that thick, layered hum you get on a warm South Texas night, even into late September, and they stopped, the same way they'd stopped before, all at once, a silence dropping over the property like someone had hit a switch. Del felt it before I said anything. I watched him sit up straighter in the porch chair, his hand going to the stock of the rifle leaned against the rail, and he said, "Lo, you feel that?" I did. The same building pressure behind the eyes. Faint at first. Climbing. We didn't go looking for it that time. We stayed on the porch, both of us with flashlights off, letting our eyes hold what little adjustment they'd gotten to the dark. And we waited. The smell came in maybe 10 minutes later. Sulfur and that chemical sweetness underneath it, stronger than I remembered from before. And underneath that, This time, something Dell noticed before I did. "Listen," he whispered. "You hear that?" It took me a second to place it. A low, rhythmic sound, almost like breathing but too regular, too mechanical to be lungs, coming from somewhere out past the pen, toward the creek, in and out, on a cycle of maybe 3 or 4 seconds, steady as a metronome. I clicked my flashlight on and swept it toward the sound. There were 2 of them. I need you to sit with that for a second, because up until that night I'd assumed, without ever really examining the assumption, that I was dealing with one animal, the same one each time, working this stretch of creek on its own. Seeing 2 changed the shape of everything I'd been telling myself. They were both crouched at the fence line, in roughly the same spot the first one had been weeks before, and from what I could make out in the beam, one was noticeably larger than the other, maybe 5 feet at full upright height, against the smaller one's 4.5, though I didn't get a clean look at either one, standing fully upright that night. The smaller one had its head low, working at something on the ground near the base of the fence, and I realized, with a slow, sick understanding, that it was a 6th goat, one we hadn't even known was missing yet because we hadn't done a head count since dinner. The larger one was upright on its hind legs, head turned toward the porch, toward us, and even at 60 yards, even with the flashlight beam wavering in my hand, I could feel those eyes on me the same way I had the first night. Dell had his rifle up, sighted, and I watched his arm the same way a rancher I later heard about must have watched his own arm on a fence line 300 miles west of here, because Dell told me afterward that his finger simply would not close on the trigger. Not fear, not hesitation in the ordinary sense, something that felt, in his words, like somebody'd unplugged the wire between my brain and my hand. The larger one made a sound then, the closest thing to a vocalization I'd heard from either of them across both encounters, a short, sharp note that wasn't quite a bark and wasn't quite a hiss, and the smaller one's head came up from the ground immediately, abandoning whatever it had been doing, and both of them dropped to all fours and were gone into the dark along the creek in the same span of 2 or 3 seconds. No sound of brush, no splash at the crossing, same as before. We found the 6th goat in the morning. Same wounds, same absence of blood, and this time, a second mark besides the puncture wounds. A shallow groove in the dirt beside the body, maybe 8 inches long, narrow, like something had dragged a single claw or finger through the packed earth there, once, and then stopped. Connie had been awake for most of that one too, unlike the first time. She'd heard Dell's truck pull in around midnight, the way she had most nights that month, and she'd stayed up in the kitchen with the lights off and the back door unlocked in case either of us needed to get inside fast, listening through the screen for whatever she could make out. She told me afterward she'd heard the cicadas cut off, same as we had, and had stood at the kitchen window watching our 2 shapes on the porch, neither of us moving, for what felt to her like a very long time before the flashlight beam finally swept out toward the pen. She didn't see the creatures themselves. The angle from the kitchen window didn't give her a clean line to the fence, but she heard the sound Dell had picked out first, that low mechanical breathing rhythm, carrying up to the house clearer than I'd realized it had, and she said afterward that the sound was the thing that stayed with her longest, worse in some ways than anything I'd described to her about the visual. A noise like that doesn't belong to anything that's supposed to be alive, she told me. Not breathing like that, not on purpose. Dell and I walked the fence line that morning before the heat got bad, working our way from the pen down toward the creek crossing, looking for anything else the dark might have hidden from us the night before. The grass along that stretch was beaten down in a couple of places, not torn up the way cattle or deer beat down grass. More like something light had passed through there low and fast, leaving a faint channel through the seed heads that was already starting to spring back upright by the time we found it. At the creek crossing itself, where the water runs maybe 8 inches deep over a bed of flat limestone shelf rock even in a dry September, we found nothing. No prints in the mud at the bank, though the mud there holds a deer track clean enough to identify the animal's age most mornings. No disturbance in the gravel bar downstream. Dell crouched at the water's edge for a long while, running his hand along the wet stone, and didn't say much, and I understood, because I'd had the same thought myself. Whatever had come through there twice now in 3 weeks wasn't leaving the kind of trail that 31 years of reading this creek bottom had taught either of us to expect. That was the last incident on my property. I want to be honest about why I think it stopped, because I don't think it was anything we did right. I think the wave simply ran its course, the way Dell's grandfather had described it doing decades before. A period of activity along this stretch of creek, followed by a long quiet, and we happened to be the ones holding the land when this particular cycle came through. Dr. Calloway called me on October the 9th with results from the lab at A&M. The tissue samples showed what she called anomalous cellular structure around the wound margins. Cell walls intact, but the interior contents altered in a way the lab technician hadn't been able to match to any known infection, toxin, or trauma pattern in their reference database. The official lab report, the one that would go in any file, listed the cause of death as exsanguination, etiology undetermined, predator activity suspected. No mention of the cellular anomalies made it into that final paperwork. Dr. Calloway told me, somewhat carefully, that the lab had recommended further analysis and then, when she followed up 3 weeks later to arrange it, was told the original samples had been logged as disposed of per standard protocol after the standard retention window, which she said was 2 months early, by her own count, and inconsistent with how she'd seen that lab handle anomalous samples in the past. I called the county extension office once more, in mid-October, mostly to close the loop, and was told that with the wave of incidents appearing to have ended, and no surviving animal evidence to test, the matter would be filed as resolved, predator-related, most likely coyote activity possibly compounded by feral hog interference, a combination that I was told accounts for the majority of unusual livestock mortality patterns reported across South Texas counties in any given year. I didn't argue. I'd learned by then that arguing only got you a longer version of the same answer. I did go back to the sheriff's office once more, in late October, to follow up on that offhand comment the young deputy had made back in September about the department having fielded similar calls over the years. I asked at the front counter whether there was any way to search old incident reports for livestock complaints matching a specific description, punctures, no blood, that kind of thing. The woman at the counter was polite, but explained that records that old, particularly ones filed as routine predator complaints rather than anything requiring follow-up investigation, weren't indexed in any way that would let her search by description, only by date, location, or the name of the reporting party, and that pulling decades of paper files on the chance some of them might match what I was describing wasn't something she had the authority or the time to do for me. I asked if I could at least speak to the deputy who'd come out to my place in September, see if he remembered anything more specific about those other calls he'd mentioned. She told me he'd transferred to a department up near Seguin that fall, family reasons, and that she didn't have a forwarding contact she was able to give out. I left my name and number in case he ever wanted to follow up himself. Nobody ever called. I quit calling it in after that, not because I stopped believing what happened, because I understood, finally, what Dell's grandfather must have understood 80 years before me, sitting on this same stretch of creek bottom with his own loaded rifle by the door, that some things on this land don't get explained, they just get survived, and you do what you can to protect what's yours, and you wait, and you hope the gap before it comes back again is a long one. I rebuilt the pen closer to the house that winter, doubled the fencing, put in 2 more motion lights with overlapping coverage so there's no blind angle the way there was before. Dell's done the same on his place. We still sit up some nights, less often now than we did in September, but enough that my wife stopped asking why the porch light stays on past midnight most weeks. Connie and I talked about all of it more than once over the winter, usually late, after the dishes were done and the television was off, the two of us sitting at that same kitchen table where she'd first told me she believed me. She asked me once, around Thanksgiving, whether I thought it knew us specifically, recognized the property, came back because it had fed here before and found the pickings easy, or whether we'd just been unlucky enough to be sitting on a stretch of ground it happened to pass through on a cycle that had nothing to do with us at all. I didn't have a good answer for her. I still don't, but I told her what I'd come to believe, which is that it probably doesn't matter much either way, because the practical response is the same regardless. You reinforce what you can reinforce. You stay alert during the months when the cicadas have a habit of going quiet without explanation. You don't go looking for trouble in the dark, and you don't pretend trouble isn't out there just because the daylight makes it easy to forget. She asked me, too, whether I regretted not pushing harder with the county, going over the deputy's head, calling the state, finding a reporter who might take the story seriously instead of laughing it off. I thought about that one for a while before I answered. I told her I didn't think pushing harder would have changed anything except how I was treated around town, that the county wasn't going to reclassify a goat's cause of death because one rancher and his neighbor were certain about what they'd seen in the dark, and that the kind of proof that would move a county record, video footage clear enough to hold up, a body of one of the creatures itself, simply wasn't something either of us had any realistic way of producing. I told her I'd rather be a man with a true story nobody believed than a man chasing a fight he was never going to win. She didn't argue with that. She just reached over and put her hand on top of mine on the table, and we sat there a while longer without saying much else, and that was about as close as either of us got to making peace with the whole thing. I want to back up for a minute and tell you about a conversation I had with Dr. Calloway in early November, a few weeks after the lab results came back and the official file got closed out, because it added a piece to this I hadn't expected, and it stayed with me since. She called me, not about my case, but because she said she wanted to follow up on something she'd mentioned in passing back in September, that contact she had in Nuevo Laredo, across the river from Laredo proper, about 2.5 hours west of us along the border. She'd reached out to him after our case, sent him photographs of the wound pattern and the burn lesion, and he'd written back within a day, which she said was unusual for him because he wasn't a man who responded quickly to much of anything. His name was Dr. Refugio Beltran, a large animal vet who'd practiced in and around Nuevo Laredo for over 30 years, and the case he'd described to her in 2019 had happened on a ranch outside the city, toward the Anahuac wetlands, goats and a few head of cattle. Same wound signature, same complete exsanguination, and the same burn pattern lesion on one animal's flank that he'd never been able to explain, and had never published. Because, in his words to her, publishing it would have ended my credibility in this profession, and I have a family to feed. Dr. Calloway, knowing I'd want more than a second-hand summary, asked him afterward if he'd be willing to put some of it in writing for her, and he sent her a few paragraphs, in Spanish, that she translated and read to me over the phone. I asked her to send me the original later, and I've kept it, even though my own Spanish is rusty enough that I mostly rely on her translation. He described the ranch as belonging to a family he'd treated for over a decade, 60 head of mixed goats and cattle on land that had been in the family since the 1950s. The first kills came in February of 2019, 3 goats over the course of a week, found the same way every time, 2 punctures, no blood, the body lighter than it should have been. He performed the same kind of examination Dr. Calloway had done on my place, opened the chest cavity, found the heart and major vessels completely empty, found the surrounding tissue around the wounds carrying a temperature higher than ambient, even many hours after death, a detail that matched exactly what Dr. Calloway had documented on the yearling buck. What he added, that Dr. Calloway hadn't seen in her own case, was a description of the burn pattern lesion appearing not just on one animal, but eventually on 3, always in the same rough location along the rib cage, always the same width, always with the hair follicles simply absent rather than damaged. He'd taken his own samples, sent them to a lab contact in Monterey rather than through any official government channel, having learned, he told her, not to trust official channels with something like this after an earlier case, years before, that had gone nowhere. Those results, too, had come back inconclusive, cellular changes the technician couldn't match to anything in their reference library, and Dr. Beltran had quietly closed the file himself rather than push it further. What struck Dr. Calloway, and what she passed on to me, was that Dr. Beltran had described 2 animals working in tandem on his case as well, a detail she hadn't mentioned to him beforehand, hadn't led him toward in any way. He'd used almost the same word she used relaying it to me. Tandem, like the two creatures were coordinating, one drawing attention while the other fed, or one larger and more confident, the other smaller and more cautious, hanging back at the edges. He'd seen them himself, once, at a distance, crossing a moonlit stretch of pasture toward a stock tank, and had described the larger one's gait as having an unsettling fluidity to it, switching between 2 legs and 4 without any visible transition, the same detail I'd watched happen at my own fence line, 300 miles north. "I don't know what to do with that," Dr. Calloway told me. 2 independent cases, separated by 5 years and 250 miles, both involving large animal vets with decades of experience, both describing paired activity instead of a single animal. That's not proof of anything, in a scientific sense, but it's a pattern, and patterns are usually trying to tell you something, even when you don't have the framework yet to understand what. I asked her if she planned to write any of this up formally, submit it anywhere, try to get it taken seriously through proper channels. She was quiet for a second on the phone. "I've thought about it," she said, "but I've also got a practice to run, and clients who trust me to be the careful, sober vet who tells them the truth about a sick calf or a difficult birth. The moment I put my name on a paper describing what I found in your shed in September, that trust changes, whether the science holds up or not. I'm not saying that's right. I'm saying it's the calculation every one of us in this position has had to make, going back generations, and most of us make the same choice in the end." I understood that. I'm not in her position, exactly, sitting here telling you this with my face and my voice instead of a clinical report, but I understand the weight of what she was describing, because I've felt some version of it myself every time I've thought about whether to put this story out at all. I talked to a handful of other ranchers since that fall, word getting around the way it does in a county this size, people who'd lost stock the same way over the years and never said much about it publicly, because what's the upside? Who wants their name attached to a story that sounds like it belongs on a late-night radio show? A man over near Westhoff, on the southwestern edge of the county, told me about losing 2 goats in the spring of 2019 with the same wound pattern, never reported it beyond a call to his insurance agent, who told him predator loss wasn't covered under his policy anyway, so there wasn't much point pursuing it further. A family outside Nordheim described a single sighting from a few years back, a shape crossing their hayfield at dusk, low and fast, that the father had written off at the time as a big dog until he heard, secondhand, about what had happened on my place. A woman who runs a small operation north of Yorktown, not far from where my own grandfather used to run his stock, told me, almost word for word, about a burn mark on a dead sheep's flank that matched what we'd found on that yearling buck, down to the strip of absent hair along the edge of it. She'd lost the sheep in October, a few weeks after my own incidents had tapered off, which fit the pattern Dr. Calloway had described to me of activity moving along a loop, working one stretch of territory before shifting to another close by. I drove out to see her place in person, in early December, mostly because something about her account matched mine closely enough that I wanted to hear it standing in the same pasture where it happened, rather than over the phone. Her name's Carol Benavides, runs about 40 head of mixed sheep and goats on 60 acres, that backs up to a different stretch of the same general watershed, closer to where Coleto Creek bends down out of Goliad County, before it eventually feeds into the Guadalupe system too, a good 15 miles north and east of my own place as the crow flies, but connected by the same web of creek bottoms that cuts through this part of South Texas. Carol's in her late 40s, runs the operation mostly on her own, since her husband passed a few years back, and she struck me as a woman who didn't have much patience left for being told what she had or hadn't seen. She walked me out to the spot where she'd found the sheep, a flat stretch of pasture maybe 80 yards from her own equipment barn, and she described the morning the same unhurried, exact way Dell had described his grandfather's stories, like she'd gone over the details enough times in her own head that the telling had worn smooth. "I didn't think anything of it at first," she told me. "I've lost stock to coyotes before. Lost one to a bobcat that got bold one winter when feed was scarce. I know what those look like. This animal looked like somebody had let the air out of her, same as you're describing, and there wasn't a drop of blood on the ground, and I stood there over her for probably 10 minutes, just turning that over in my head before I let myself believe what I was looking at. She hadn't called anyone official about it, said she'd watched enough of what happened to other people in the county, word traveling the way it does, to know that filing a report wouldn't get her anything but a form letter and maybe a little bit of a reputation she didn't want. Instead, she'd reinforced her own fencing the same way Dell and I had, added motion lighting, started keeping a dog inside at night instead of out, and let it go at that. I don't expect it to come back to my exact spot, she said, looking off toward the tree line where Colado Creek cuts through about 200 yards from her pasture. Not for a good while anyway, if what you're telling me about the pattern holds. But I don't forget it's out there somewhere along this water. You don't forget something like that. Before I left her place that afternoon, Carol mentioned something her own mother-in-law had told her years before, back when Carol had first married into the family and moved out to that property. The mother-in-law, gone now, had grown up on a ranch closer to Goliad, southeast of where Carol's land sits now, and had talked once, only once, about something her own father used to call by a name Carol couldn't quite remember anymore. Some old phrase that had nothing to do with the word Chupacabra, because by the time that word reached this part of Texas in the mid-90s, some families out here already had their own private name for whatever this was, passed down quiet, generation to generation, the same way Dell's family had their word for it on the other side of the county. She never told me the actual word, Carol said, just that there was one and that her father used to say it under his breath sometimes when the dogs got restless at night for no reason. I always figured it was just old superstition, the kind every ranching family has some version of. I don't figure that anymore. None of these people had filed reports that stuck. Most of them, like me, had called it in once, gotten the same predator activity explanation from whoever answered the phone, and let it go, because pushing harder didn't change the form that got filled out, and pushing harder did put your name on something that could follow you around a small county for years. I don't know what it is. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I've got it figured out, because I don't, and anybody who tells you they do is selling you something. What I know is what I saw, twice, at close range, on ground I've worked my whole life, ground my own grandfather worked before me 20 miles south of here, and what Dell's family has quietly known and lived alongside for the better part of a century without ever putting it in any report that would stick. It comes through this creek bottom on its own schedule. It's been doing that since before either of our families had a word for it. The official record, every time, says coyote, says feral dog, says predator activity consistent with regional wildlife patterns, and every time, the people who actually found the bodies and stood at the fence line in the dark know that record isn't the whole truth, and most of us, in the end, decide it isn't worth the fight to say so out loud. I've thought a lot, over the months since, about why this part of Texas in particular. The Guadalupe and its tributaries cut a long corridor through brush country that hasn't changed much in 150 years. Mesquite flats and creek bottoms and limestone shelf rock running from up around Gonzales clear down through Victoria and out toward the coast. The same kind of country that runs along most of South Texas, where ranching's been the way of life since before this was the United States at all. Whatever's working that corridor has had a long, undisturbed run of it, generation after generation of livestock to draw from, and generation after generation of ranching families inclined, by temperament and by necessity, to keep their mouths shut about anything the county wouldn't believe anyway. It's not lost on me that Dr. Beltran's case sits along a different stretch of water entirely, the Rio Grande borderlands rather than the Guadalupe system, and that whatever pattern connects his account to mine and to Carol's and to Dell's grandfather's stories isn't confined to one river or one county. If it's the same thing, or the same kind of thing, working multiple corridors across South Texas and down into Mexico on its own separate cycles, that's a wider problem than any of us individually have the standing or the proof to make anybody take seriously. All we've got is what we've each seen with our own eyes, on our own land, compared quietly against what a handful of other people have seen on theirs. I'm only saying it now because enough time's passed that I figure it's worth it, for whatever that's worth to you, sitting wherever you're sitting, a long way from Sandy's Creek. If you're out here in DeWitt County, or anywhere along this stretch of the Guadalupe watershed, and you find something in your pen some morning that doesn't add up, I'd ask you to look close before you let anybody talk you into the easy answer. Check the ground for blood. There usually isn't any. And if the cicadas go quiet some night for no reason you can name, I wouldn't go out looking for what caused it. I'd just go inside, and lock the door, and wait for the sun. I check my fence line every morning now before coffee. Some habits, once a thing like this puts them in you, don't go away. I don't expect mine to.